And you've just heard Everyone Is Here, which is the opening track on the album Aired, the new album from Andrew Eaton Lewis. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Andrew now. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. It's good to see you as well. And before we get to the album, tell us about the song we've just heard and where it fits into the whole.
Well, it's a sort of introductory song, I suppose, and it's kind of hard to talk about that without talking about the rest of the album. So Aired is it's a collection of songs which are very much rooted in a very specific place, which is a village in the Outer Hebrides, up on a high cliff top. Aired is the Gaelic word for headlands, heights, or promontory. So there's quite a few places called Aired scattered around Scotland, all in high places. This one is a village of less than 30 people up on a high cliff top, which used to be an RAF radar station in the
Right.
Cold War. So if you were the Russians and you were thinking of invading the UK, then this little corner of the Outer Hebrides would be a very good place to do it. And that was also the case in the Second World War. There were lots of stories of U-boats, being just off the coast of this island here. But yeah, I mean, Aired, as it turns out, I mean, the radar base was closed down and mostly closed down kind of late 60s. But it's now become this kind of community of sort of artists and musicians and sort of landscape gardeners and sort of interesting little sort of community on what a lot of people think of as the edge of the world, but
Mm.
is hence the lyrics of that song. But I mean, as a neighbour of mine here is fond of pointing out, it's only the edge of the world if you think in very sort of modern terms, in terms of kind of rail travel and car travel. For the Vikings, it was not the edge of the world. I mean, it was a kind of and in some ways, sort of militarily, it's not the edge of the world. It's like kind of it would be a kind of key place,
Yeah.
sort of strategically for navies. So there's all kinds of interesting ways in which it's very much not the edge of the world. And I suppose that opening song is about the fact that there are all kinds of different people who find their way to a place like this, and that's one of the things I find interesting about Aired. It's a really interesting, very diverse community.
Because you're really telling stories on the album. That's how I kind of
Mm.
listen to it as well, about people and place. Did you collect songs, or was it just as they came to you?
Well, I sort of have to be careful here because I'm not sort of wanting to speak for the people of Air at all.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I have any right to do that. I've only been sort of here for the past few years, um, uh, and so I also, in case anybody from Air is listening, I want to really emphasize that there are no songs on here that are about anyone specific. That they're not stories of the people of this village. What I was interested in, I think, more was Aired as a kind of metaphor. I mean, it's very consciously called. I mentioned that Ed is this Gaelic word for kind of the heights and a kind of a sort of a vantage point, I suppose. And so it's exploring the idea of somewhere like this as a vantage point on the world. What does the rest of the world look like from living in a place like this? I mean, a couple of these songs date right back to lockdown,
Right.
as I think a lot of songs these days still do. The people
Yeah,
are still kind of reflecting on that
very much so.
massively kind of tumultuous period in their lives. And there's a song here called "The Stream," for example, which was written at a point where I was. I basically didn't leave this village more or less for about a year and a half. I mean, not that's that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there was a lot of time
Yeah.
spent in one place, and I suppose after that I became interested in the idea of writing songs that are kind of rooted in a place. But I do want to emphasize that if there are any stories that seem to be about people, they're not about specific people who live there. I'm combining different
Yeah.
elements. Yeah,
And it's actually more referencing place and space. You've got caves, you've got stream, you've got abandoned cottages, yeah, the
yeah,
buildings, abandoned buildings, cottages, all those things. So it's a kind of looking at that side of things rather than personal. It's not
yeah. I mean,
abstract, but looking at the place more widely.
Yeah, there's one song called "Prospect Cottage," for example, and that is a reference not to Anywhere Here, but to the Derek Jarman's house. You know, the filmmaker Derek Jarman
Yeah.
famously lived in this cottage in Dungeness, which was next to a power station. So this, this place was, and he made this garden at Prospect Cottage, which was this incredible, beautiful garden, which kind of defied the odds in terms of being in this very exposed, windswept landscape, but somehow survived. And I thought that was a really powerful metaphor. And so, yeah, Prospect Cottage came out with this idea that there's a sort of parallel between someone building a garden next to this big power station and people building gardens and building kind of life for themselves on a very exposed cliff top that was once a military base. You know, I see bits of sort of affinity between these things. So it's like, yeah, it's the songs are sort of partly rooted in Aird, but partly sort of comparing Aird to other places and other sort of similar landscapes, I guess.
Yeah. I felt there was a real similarity in terms of how these songs are written and how they sound, a lot of them, with Blue Nile's A Walk Across the Rooftops. If
Oh,
that
really?
is
Okay.
a view over a cityscape, which I think it is
Mm.
over Glasgow, feel almost like you've got someone, scattered flying over the city and seeing these little stories unfold in these places and all that. And I think this album does the same for the rural landscape that where you are. That,
Well,
there's a kind of overview that's going on and these stories kind of emerge.
well, I'm delighted by that. I mean, I'm a massive Blue Nile fan, and you're right. Their songs are very, very evocative of a particular place, which is Glasgow. I remember being in a taxi queue one time at Buchanan Street Station and spotting Paul Buchanan in the queue, and it was raining, and the city was glittering, and I remember thinking this is like the perfect Glasgow moment. I felt like I'm in a Blue Nile song, and there's the person from the Blue Nile standing, a couple of people away from me. I had a great pleasure of having a long chat with Paul Buchanan like years ago when I was a journalist, and yeah, lovely man. Yeah, big Blue Nile fan.
Well, that kind of brings us on to the sound, because some of the tracks do, I think, have that kind of melancholy feel to them. But there are other ones, like Spooky Abandoned Buildings, which are they are slightly different kind of scratchy sound to them, if you like.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the music and how the album was made.
Well, it was made in the village of Aird, which is another reason why it's called Aird. And this is my first kind of proper experiment in home recording since I was a teenager. You know, I used to
Right.
make loads of songs as a teenager on an old kind of 4-track reel-to-reel. But I have, for the first time after many years of working with producers, started recording at home. Now I say this, I mean, I have a very, for those of you, watching this on YouTube, I am in what I laughingly call my home studio, which is basically a piano and just a little sort of a DI box and not very much more than that.
And a
But so
little
I should
drum.
say that, and in fact, the percussion was done for this album. I'll give you a little taste of it on this little wooden drum, which makes it sound very, very lo-fi, and in some ways it was. But what I then did was I sent all the tracks off to my one of my best friends, Hamish in Edinburgh, who I used to be in a band with for many years, and who is now over the years become a brilliant producer. And he effectively he mastered it, but he also added. He made it sound like a record. He made it sound big. I mean, if you were to hear my sort of solo version of this, it would sound very tinny and small and very obviously recorded in a small room in the Outer Hebrides. But he's given it these lovely textures and turned these kind of tinny little sort of handmade percussion sounds into, well, on that first track that that you played, it becomes a bit of a sort of electro pop epic for a few seconds at least.
Well, that's really interesting because it has got a really rich sound going on, although they never overpower the songs. I don't think, there's lots of things in the songs to really get into. And a lot of it, as you've kind of hinted at, is about the perspective of living on an island. Would that be fair to say? Doing a different
Yeah,
perspective,
yeah.
perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I've sort of been a bit between Edinburgh and the Outer Hebrides for a long time now, um, and moving between the two places really makes me appreciate both and the contrasts. Um, I mean, it's this village is very quiet. I mean, but it's also very exposed to the elements. You know, it's quite sort of wild place to live. There's a and I mean, what's interesting to me about Erddig in particular is it's certainly not your typical Hebridean village in that it's these old military buildings. I mean, at least half of it is old sort of concrete bunker-like military buildings that people have turned into homes. But for a newcomer like me, for an incomer like me, I feel quite at home here because this village, or that part of the village at least, is no older than me. You know, it became a village in the early 1970s, and so a lot of the people here have moved here since then. You know, there are some people who are Hebridean natives and have been here for generations, but there are also a lot of people like me who are from all kinds of walks of life and have all kinds of different reasons to come here. But yeah, it feels like quite a new place. Yeah. Although weirdly, in as a sort of microcosm, I was thinking about this week. You know how Edinburgh has the interesting mix of old and new, and it's a sort of very much sort of split, and the kind of culture of the city often kind of reflects that. You know, you think of Jekyll and Hyde. You know, it's seen as a sort of city with a kind of split personality, sort of the old part and the new part. Yeah. There's something of that in Aird as well. You know, I mean, half of it are these old, sort of much older houses, and it's an old crofting village that has been there for a long time, and then there's this other half of it, so which is these strange old military buildings. So it's a place of two personalities. It's quite sort of, I mean, so yeah, there's rich material for a songwriter, shall I say, in many different ways.
And splitting that time between Aird and Edinburgh, that's quite an interesting thing. Do you ever feel kind of discombobulated moving between them? The reason I ask is that my brother has lived in the village of Braemar for 20 odd years now, and when he comes to a city, it kind of overwhelms him. But maybe you're split enough that you've not got to that.
I know. I do get that. I mean, I've had times when I've been driving to Inverness and suddenly you notice the orange glow in the sky, having got used to a place with absolutely no light pollution and in fact no street lighting. So that's quite strange. And so by the time you get down to the Forth Bridge, you feel like you're in Blade Runner. You know, but I like that. I mean, I like that. I really notice the differences. You know, I really notice the Hebrideanness of the Hebrides when I'm there, and I really notice the Edinburghness, and I mean, it's like sort of at its most extreme for me in the summer, because the time that I spend most time on the mainland is at the Edinburgh Festival. Yeah. So I will go, you know, from week to week to the biggest arts festival in the world and all the madness of that, to this tiny village where really anyone you talk to doesn't really care about about all that. You know, they don't really ask you questions about it. And again, I love that, because in somewhere like Edinburgh, particularly during the festival, you can be really sort of stuck in a bubble. You know, you can think that the things that happen around you in that immediate space matters. And to go from that to the Hebrides, I think it's very I know. I think it's good for the soul, actually. Yeah. And the other thing. I mean, I spoke about the sort of diverseness of the population here. I mean, it's in a small community. You sort of have to get on with everybody, you know. And you're very conscious that if you have any sort of disagreement with someone, you still have to see them in the village shop every day. And so you can't live in a bubble, and you can't live in a yeah, it's a place where you have to sort of step outside culture wars, for example. You know, you're not the people around you are not necessarily going to share your opinions on anything in particular. So yeah, but I like that as well. You have to learn diplomacy and tact and learn to get on with everybody. You know,
and in some ways, the album is about perspective, as in perspective of the rest of the world. There's a couple of tracks that relate to that as well. And do you think that has changed for you? You know, you're almost in an isolated space and looking out. Maybe more time and thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say it's isolated, because there's a really strong sense of community here. I mean, I know my neighbours and my local community here much better than I ever did in Edinburgh or Glasgow. You know, that's the thing.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, absolutely.
You do know everybody. You can't sort of you can't hide from anybody. But yeah, I mean, there's a song at the end of this album called "The Kids Are All That Matters," which is about my children kind of growing to an age now where they are starting to be much more aware of the outside world. You know, when they were little, they were quite happy just to just roam around and make dens, and so this village was a really great place for them, and still is to an extent. But they are reaching an age now where they're starting to be more aware of cities, and how exciting cities seem, and so that's something I feel quite conflicted about, because I want to keep them safe, but I'm also recognize that, like any parent of kids of a certain age, they have to spread their wings and they have to go to other places. But it's a scary world out there right now. But who knows? But I think we're recording this about 3 weeks ahead of it going out. Who knows what's going to have changed during that time?
Absolutely.
The world seems to be becoming more precarious by the day at the moment. But then that's another. Like I said, Aird is this ex-military base, and it's a very strange feeling quite often, having what is quite a place of peace and sanctuary and perspective, looking out of the world, walking amongst all these buildings that were built for war, as the song, as that first song puts it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about The Kids Are All Right, because that's the final track on the album as well, and it's a kind of perfect end in that way. And it was also a single too. Was that always going to be almost a kind of slightly different track?
No, I did this thing last year where I put out the songs one by one for a while, just to kind of test the waters, and that was the one. It wasn't really a single as such, but it was the one that got picked up on radio a bit. I think Roddy Hart played it, and perhaps he liked the Donald Trump reference, because there is a bit of a reference to Donald Trump on that song, and Trump kind of famously came from here. His mother was from Lewis, and yeah.
And we're about to hear in a moment You Wouldn't Want Me as Your Village Bard, which is one of my favourite tracks on it. And it's just, I'm intrigued by the song, the title, the lyrics, everything about it. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's kind of a self-deprecating joke. There is this old Gaelic tradition of village bards, which, as I understand it, were people who would kind of tell and therefore preserve the stories of their community and the traditions of their community through verse, through song, this is something I don't think I could ever claim to be. I certainly, because I've not lived here very long, I'm not a native. I don't really speak Gaelic very well. My Gaelic is appalling. In fact, I'm probably pronouncing the name of my own album wrong. So if there's any Gaelic listeners may want to correct me. But on the other hand, I am in some ways literally a village bard. I'm a songwriter of a village, and so that song is a sort of slightly self-deprecating joke about that, but it's also about I'm really interested in what a village bard would look like now. It's understandable kind of in the age of kind of oral storytelling tradition where the stories of your village would be passed on from generation to generation. That's it makes sense as a tradition. But now, if you want to find out about a village anywhere in the world, you can look it up on Google Maps. There's probably most of the population of that village are on social media. There's lots of places in which you can find out about a village. So the song is also partly about what would a village bard now look like, and what purpose would it serve, and it's also about kind of gossip, and it's about lots of different things. But anyway, but it's mostly it's a kind of knowing joke, and it's sort of perhaps it's maybe a signal to the people who live here that I am not claiming to be some representative of the community. I wouldn't I wouldn't want to do that. There's lots of other people who could do that perfectly well. Before
we hear it, are there any plans to play these songs live at all?
There are, although I'm doing it. Well, I think this interview is going out after this actually happens. So by the time this goes out, I will have played a wildly successful album launch.
Hugely successful, absolutely.
Hopefully, at Unlanta in Stornoway. The other gigs will be, I think, subject to demand. But we'll see.
Well, let us know, and I will let our listeners know anyway. Andrew, it's always good to speak to you. Thanks so much for taking the time to do so.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And this is Andrew Eaton Lewis, and You Wouldn't Want Me as Your Village Bard.